Hi everyone, welcome to FNArena Talks. My name is Danielle Ecuyer, and today I'm very excited to be discussing all climate change impacts on investing, on the economy, and we're going to gauge the impacts of these awful weather events that we've seen across the east coast of Australia and also in Northern Europe with the heat waves, and trying to assess from an expert opinion how these impacts are going to be felt on our economy. So just to highlight that none of the information discussed today is personal recommendations or information for your own personal investing. All the information is general in nature. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Professor Matthew England, and he is Professor of Ocean and Climate Dynamics at the University of New South Wales. Welcome, Matt. Thank you so much for joining us. And could you just give us a brief introduction about yourself?
Yeah, look, thanks, Danielle. It's great to be here and join you talking about this topic. And so my name is Matthew England, as you said. I'm a professor at the Climate Change Research Centre at UNSW. And what that means, my job is all about understanding the way the world's climate is changing, understanding how that's affecting things like heat waves and extreme rainfall events, also understanding ocean warming, sea level rise. So all the physics of the climate system, if you like, and in turn, how it's going to impact a bunch of different sectors.
Fantastic. So let's jump straight to it. For the average man in the street, could you explain to them how much these incredible floods that we've seen on the east coast of Australia, how much of those, and also these awful heat events that we're seeing across Europe by way of example, which I actually think is also in the United States, how much of these events can actually be attributed to climate change?
Yeah, and so it's a good question, and a lot of people want this question answered. And so attribution of each event is a very challenging thing because each event comes along with its own weather characteristics. And in a way, the best way to put it is these weather patterns that we're having are being modulated by climate change. And so these flooding events, the individual East Coast low patterns that occur, they're weather events. And so people kind of can go, let's just dismiss them. But the reality is the severity of their impact is ramping up over time. And so the best question is not so much, is this due to climate change, but is this made worse by climate change? And we can answer categorically yes, because the oceans are warming, that's energizing the hydrological cycle, it's loading up the atmosphere with more moisture. And so when the extreme event comes along, the amount of rainfall that's being dumped, for example, is much increased because of this ocean warming. The drought cycles we have are enhanced by the enhanced hydrological cycle. And heat waves are even more directly related to global warming. We know the heat waves that are off the charts in Europe at the moment, they're just multiple standard deviations above the average. They're multiple standard deviations above the worst ever experienced. And we know that's in keeping with basic climate physics. When you trap the world's atmosphere with extra greenhouse gases, you're basically energizing the whole system. You're keeping extra heat in our atmosphere, and that's leading to a big ramp up of heat waves and these intense tropical cyclones and intense storms.
Okay, so if we go on from that, if we're an investor or an economist and we're looking at our economies, which part of our economies are going to be, or I suppose the way we live, which part is going to be most impacted by the effects that we're seeing from the ramping up of these weather events from climate change?
Yeah, it's another really good question, Danielle. I mean, it's one of these things that we're already seeing some of the sectors that are most impacted being the most outspoken about the need to address the problem with reducing greenhouse gases. And so one of the ones really obviously impacted very near term is the insurance sector. And I say that because the insurance sector has been setting premiums for decades now based on risk. And they do that by understanding the risk for certain regions, for certain events, whether it's your house that's being insured, a car, property, businesses, anything that's insured is based on a risk analysis. And that analysis, unfortunately, is tricky for them right now because the system is changing so rapidly that years ago when the Brisbane floods occurred, there were certain properties right on the Brisbane River there that the insurance sector said, we can't go back and insure this property. And they were criticized for that. But actually, if they look at the science and saw the risk of these return floods occurring, they more or less came out and said, we can give you an insurance policy, but it would be 10% of the value of the property. We'd want 10,000, sorry, we'd want $100K per annum for this $1 million property, because that's our perceived risk. And that with enough of these extreme events, that those companies could go under. They could have more claims than they've got finances to cover the claims. And so that's really one of the frontline industries that is impacted by climate change. And there's a whole bunch of others. I mean, the agriculture sector is also, we saw Brown Brothers a couple of years ago, the winery, go and buy land in Tasmania. They just perceived that there was a risk to their vineyards in South Australia. So agriculture is impacted, food production, water, all infrastructure as well. I mean, that sort of, we're seeing in the UK, buckling of rail lines. If you build something these days and you build it to the extremes that we've had up to today, there's no guarantee that the extremes we're going to see in the next decade even will respect those historical records. We're seeing records broken. I think it's actually, I could rephrase your question if I can for a moment. If you ask me what sector isn't impacted by climate change, I would struggle to answer that question, because it does cut across all of what we do. And that's why I'm getting off topic a little bit, but when I see a big protest by an Extinction Rebellion group or a bunch of Greenpeace protesters turn up at the lawn of Parliament House and have a sit in there, I understand where those protests are coming from. I get that voice. I understand that voice. But I'm also worried when I see those protesters that people kind of go, oh, this is just another greenie issue. It's another thing we can dismiss as being conservationists trying to protect the environment. It's gotten to the stage now where it's not a greenie issue at all. It's actually an issue that cuts into finance, business, infrastructure, housing, building, coastal environment, everything. And so when I see those protests, I wish I saw men and women in suits and ties and all sectors of society getting up there, doctors and teachers and everybody, because it's one of these things that's just basically going to be affecting every sector.
Yeah, I think you very much hit the nail on the head in terms of central banks are starting to realize it. Mark Carney, the former head of I've forgotten the name, the Reserve Bank equivalent in England, the Bank of England, was very, very active on this topic, because obviously there are major costs that are going to be incurred, and ultimately somebody has to pick up those costs, and clearly that falls back onto the governments of the day. So maybe going on, because you have touched on how these impacts are becoming more elevated, and there is, I think, talk out in the investment industry and also with some large investors saying that we're not going to make the cuts in carbon emissions and the changes we need to make for 1.5 degrees of warming, and it'll be more likely to be 2 or 2.5 degrees. So from a scientific perspective, could you, again, in kind of layman's terms, the person in the street, explain the implications of missing those targets and also what we need to do to try and achieve them?
Yeah, no, it's a really good thing to talk about, because unfortunately, the way carbon works in the atmosphere, and so a lot of people could often get confused. Why do we always talk about carbon dioxide and not say methane, nitrous oxide, water vapor, all these other greenhouse gases? Why is carbon the big enemy, so to speak? And the reason why we talk about carbon dioxide so much is that when we get it into the atmosphere by burning fossil fuels, you just can't get it out of the atmosphere. That you see some proposals sometimes, big vacuum cleaners or biochar or seaweed, kelp forests, all these different initiatives trying to draw down carbon. Nothing can do that at scale. If you think about coal production, it's when biomass, a forest falls in the trees die in the forest, they get compacted over literally hundreds of thousands of years, millions of years. You eventually build coal reserves by decomposed biology. So to artificially the big challenge that we have for innovators in a way is to artificially make coal, like remake the coal we burn. It's what biochar, some of these companies that are proposing to produce synthetic coal, if you like, they're trying to accelerate that carbon cycle from 1,000,000 years to 10 minutes. And that's look at that time scale. Nobody's gotten near to that problem. We can't suck carbon out of the atmosphere fast enough for what we're putting into the atmosphere. So the reason why people are talking about 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and so on as being challenging is that our rate of emissions is going through the roof right at a time when we're trying to bring the curve right down. And that's where I am hopeful. That's why I love talking on this program, because it's really, it's a matter of the investment going to stopping those emissions. It means, diverting investment in the fossil fuel sector. That sector, and that's why I do like the way the business sector values risk. That sector is a highly risky investment right now. Nobody should be lending money to a big coal mine being built, any coal-fired power stations, because there's a risk that'll be a stranded asset. And so when you get pessimistic about the lack of government action on this issue, it's easy to get optimistic that the business sector has, one, got a lot of people who are aware of the problem and are aware of the scale of the problem, what needs to be done. And secondly, the business sector moves fast. When something is seen as a bad investment, like a fossil fuel piece of infrastructure, then very quickly the money can dry up for those initiatives, and the money starts flowing through to electric vehicles, to electrifying the grid system we have, solar panels, storage, all these solutions that are out there. They are going to need investment. They're going to drive big business advances. There's a lot of money to be made in actually solving this problem. And so that's why when I give talks, you often end as a scientist by saying, we've got this huge problem on our hands. The positive is that we can also end by saying there's a huge opportunity to grow wealth, grow jobs, grow a new economy. If we sat here doing the same thing over and over, we're not going to create new jobs. A lot of the coal mining sector is automated these days. So I think that's the positive. That 1.5 degrees C target is looking really out of reach, but 2 degrees C is within reach. It just needs a massive reorganization of what we do. But the positive is there's big benefit, especially for a country like Australia. I think there are nations that are, developed nations that don't have the same, solar energy hitting their nation. We've got massive reserves of things like lithium and silicate and so on that's needed for solar cells. The mining sector is going to boom. We need lots of copper to electrify the grid. Mining's going to be fine. We just need that investment in renewables to kickstart that new economy.
Fantastic, Mac. There, of course, has been, I think, some concerns that basically because of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that Europe is switching at the moment. But I would also say that looking at some results of a US company that came out last night, Enphase Energy, which has been a very successful investment for lots of people. Their business, as I understand it, is booming in Europe. So it's great to hear that it's not all of just about restarting coal-fired power stations. There is a move continuing on as a result of this risk of being exposed to Russia cutting off the gas supplies. But I guess my last question to you would be, in terms of if you had a message for both businesses and investors as a scientist, what would that message be?
Yeah, I think the message would be along the lines of what I was trying to sum up at the very end there. Like, this is a massive problem. It's going to reorganize what we do. It's a huge risk left untouched. The risks to virtually every sector of society of unchecked greenhouse gas emissions are so great that we need to do something about it, because we don't like risk. The business community does not thrive on risk at all. In fact, it's quite the opposite. But then secondly, that message that there's a tremendous amount of money to be made. And it sounds vulgar to say that, but it's the truth. We need people going to solar plus storage in Australia, and there's different solutions in other countries. We need to be exporting massive battery, rather than sending coal off in these big freighters around the world, that the future will be sending, Australia's lucky, we'll produce easily more solar energy than we can use. We'll be able to export that solar energy to other nations. And so it's a big opportunity. It's an opportunity to make change that will limit that climate risk that I spoke about earlier on, but also grow a new economy, grow new jobs and new businesses. And clearly, the business community, I think what we've seen, they've made a few steps forward, and then we've seen changes of government and the incentives to make those steps have been taken away. So I do understand why we've maybe not had the progress we'd like to now, especially in Australia with governments changing on the back of climate policy all too often. But I think we've got to the stage now where it's so clear the costs of inaction from these floods and bushfires and all these events just far outstrip any cost of changing our technologies, that the business community can get on board with a lot of confidence that it's going to be a smart decision, a smart investment decision, and really writing's on the wall for ongoing investment in fossil fuel and fossil fuel production.
Excellent. So maybe I could suggest, would it be a good idea for anybody who is looking to invest in certain assets that they had some level of certainty that the management or the managers of those assets had actually sought advice and counsel from some form of climate analysis for those assets going forward, particularly if they're longer dated?
Yeah, it's a brilliant suggestion. I know there's a lot of initiatives around to sort of rate. We get sort of AAA ratings for certain companies or governments or whatever, to have that sort of carbon rating. How exposed are companies to carbon policy, to climate change, all these things. And I think with that, and of course, investors want that. You want to understand how exposed any company you're going to invest in. You want to understand how exposed it is to this carbon challenge. And I think it's brilliant that for investors to know, super funds and so on, you need to understand what risk you're getting yourself caught up in. And they're not far away. I mean, talked about, risk of sort of investment 20 years from now, but really it's risk even today, because a lot of things are being changed. A lot of areas that we invest in are being affected by climate change already today. So it's not something just for the super funds to think about. It's also for shorter term investments as well.
Great. And last question. If anybody wants to learn more about climate change and future possible impacts, or what the scientific community is saying, is there any information or websites you could guide people to that would help them in a way that is understandable, as opposed to what's produced for your scientific peer-reviewed papers?
Yeah, no, well, I mean, the IPCC is often spoken about, and the idea those reports are really, they're for policymakers, intergovernmental. If you read the titles, they're for policymakers, but I think they're largely understandable definitely the whole of the business sector would gobble those reports up. They're long. The full reports are, could knock somebody out if you throw them, on somebody's desk. They're 1,000-page documents in their totality, but the front end summary for policymakers is more like a 50-page document summarizing all the science. They're fantastic. But also the Academy of Science here in Australia, I was involved in a couple of reports that, basically questions and answers about climate change. Those reports are only sort of brochure length, 10, 15 pages, very readable. But it's a good question, because when you go to the internet and try to look for climate change information, you'll get as much disinformation as information. And unfortunately, it's a labyrinth out there. And, I would just say, go to the trusted sources, the academies of science here in Australia, National Academy in the US, the Royal Society in the UK, all these, trusted, credible, they're old institutions of scientific, with well-credentialed scientists that will put these reports out, the IPCC. So there's a bunch of reports out there, but I agree, we aren't necessarily good as scientists at just saying some of these things in short, pithy statements. So there's even Mike Mann put out an illustrated guide to the IPCC. Oh no, it was Gavin Schmidt from NASA put out a lovely illustrated guide. I think it was either Mike or Gavin. I forget. I shouldn't quote the author without remembering, but they put out an illustrated guide to the IPCC where it's just all photos and very short text, and it's almost like a children's book, except for the fact that some of it's scary reading if we do nothing about the emissions problem we have.
Absolutely. Well, just to let the listeners know, people can follow you on Twitter. And so we'll put all the links in the notes to the YouTube. And Matt, I just wanted to thank you so much for your time today. I found it very, very interesting. And I do think this is clearly a topic that's not going away, and nor should it go away. And I always say to people, the richest man in the world produces electric vehicles, which really sums it up, doesn't it? There's a lot of money to be made.
Absolutely. Thanks, Danielle. Great to join you.
Thank you very much for joining us on FNArena Talks.
Thank you.